there's something quietly wrong with the way most people have been taught to manifest. And the strange part is, it doesn't look wrong at all. In fact, it sounds logical. Visualize what you want. Repeat it consistently. Stay positive. Keep going. And eventually, it should happen. But here's what almost no one questions. If that model were truly aligned with how reality works, you wouldn't still feel like something is missing. Because you've already done it. You've thought about it. Between where you are and what you're trying to experience. And from that point on, everything begins to organize around that gap. Time starts to feel necessary. Effort starts to feel required. Reality starts to feel like something you have to reach, instead of something you can access. But what if that entire structure is inverted? What if the reason things feel slow isn't because you need more time, but because you're unknowingly reinforcing the version of yourself that is still waiting? Because if the foundation remains, it's not here yet, then no matter what you do, the only possible outcome is more waiting. And this is where most people get stuck. Not because they lack ability, but because they're operating inside a model that is built on delay. Now, there is another way to look at this. One that doesn't involve waiting, doesn't depend on time, and doesn't require you to make anything happen. A way where the shift isn't gradual, but immediate. Not because something outside moves faster, but because the need for time itself starts to disappear. And when that begins to make sense, one question naturally emerges. If it's not about waiting, then why does it still feel like everything takes time? There's a quiet paradox at the center of almost everything you've been taught about manifestation. And it doesn't look like a problem at first. It actually feels like progress. Because the more you try, the more it seems like you should be getting closer. More focus, more visualization, more repetition, more effort. But here's what most people never stop to notice. Every time you try to make something happen, you're also reinforcing the idea that it hasn't happened yet. Not with your words, but with your state. Because effort always carries a signal, and that signal is simple. This is not mine yet. Even if you're saying the opposite. Even if your thoughts sound aligned. Even if you're repeating everything correctly. If there's effort behind it, there's distance inside it. And reality doesn't respond to what you say. It responds to what you sustain. So the moment you place your desire in the future, even subtly, you create space between you and it. A gap. And that gap becomes structural. It starts shaping your perception, your reactions, your expectations. You begin to visualize from absence, to want from distance, to act from the idea that something is missing, and without realizing it, you stabilize that version of yourself, the one who is still trying, still reaching, still almost there, and almost is one of the most stable states there is, because it never collapses. It just continues, almost ready, almost aligned, almost happening, but never fully here, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the foundation hasn't changed. You're still operating from movement, from reaching, from becoming. And as long as that movement exists, so does the distance. So maybe the real question isn't, what else do I need to do to make this happen? Maybe it's something much simpler and much more confronting. Why am I still operating as someone who needs to make it happen? There's a deeply ingrained assumption in the way most people understand change. The idea that time is what creates it, that things happen gradually, that progress builds step by step. That reality unfolds little by little, until eventually it becomes something different. And on the surface, that seems true, because that's how most things appear to work. But if you look more closely, you'll start to notice something unusual. Not all change follows that pattern. Some things don't build, they shift, suddenly, without visible preparation, without a clear sequence leading up to them, as if something reorganized all at once. And that raises a different possibility. What if time isn't the cause of change, but only the record of it? What if time isn't creating anything, but simply reflecting what is already being sustained now? Because if you're honest, you'll notice that some things in your life haven't changed, despite time passing. Months go by, years go by, and certain patterns remain exactly the same. Not because you didn't try, but because something deeper didn't move. A baseline, a state, a pattern that stayed intact. And as long as that pattern remains, time doesn't transform it. It repeats it. It doesn't accelerate. It doesn't correct. It doesn't fix. It mirrors, which means what feels like waiting might not be waiting at all. It might be repetition, the same internal structure, expressing itself through different days, different situations, different circumstances, but with the same foundation underneath. And this is why, for many people, it feels like things are delayed, as if reality is taking too long to respond. But reality is already responding. It's just not responding to what you think you're sending. It's responding to what remains stable, to what doesn't change, to what continues, even when you're not paying attention. And this is where everything begins to shift, because reality doesn't follow time. It follows coherence. Coherence between what you think, what you feel, and what you sustain throughout the day. Without trying, not the peak moments, not the intentional effort, but the underlying pattern. Because it's not the strongest moment that defines your experience, it's the most consistent one. So maybe it's not about speeding things up. Maybe it's about noticing what is actually being held in place, because that is what time is reflecting. At this point, it's natural to reach a conclusion. Then I just need to do it better. Visualize more clearly, feel it more deeply, be more consistent. And for a moment, that feels like the answer. But look closer. That's still the same model, just refined. It's still effort, still adjustment, still based on the idea that something needs to be reached. And that's why, even when you improve your approach, the results often remain unstable, because the real issue was never the technique. It was the position you're operating from. There's a subtle difference here, but it changes everything. The difference between trying to access a reality and already being positioned within it. When you try to access something, you're still identifying as someone who doesn't have it, even if you're more focused, even if you're more intentional. There's still movement, still a sense of going toward. And that movement, no matter how refined, still carries distance. Now consider the opposite. What happens when there is no attempt, no internal movement toward something? What happens when you're no longer trying to reach, but instead operating from a place where it's already resolved? Not as a thought, but as a baseline, as a state. Everything shifts, because you're no longer trying to produce a result. You're maintaining a position, and that position doesn't require constant effort. It requires stability. This is why some people don't follow any specific technique and still experience rapid change, not because they know more, but because they're not caught in the cycle of trying to get there. They're operating from a different place, a more direct one. Now, this doesn't mean there's no role for practice. It means the role changes. Practice is no longer something you use to achieve. It becomes something you use to sustain. And that distinction is critical. Because when practice becomes an attempt, it reinforces absence. But when it becomes stabilization, it reinforces presence. And this is where most people get stuck. They keep treating manifestation like a process of building something, when in reality, it's a process of positioning. You're not constructing a new reality. You're selecting where you relate from. And as long as that position doesn't change, no technique will override it, no matter how advanced it seems. So maybe it's not about finding a better method. Maybe it's something simpler and more challenging. What would it feel like to stop operating as someone who is trying to get there and begin observing what it means to operate without that need, without that movement, without that underlying not yet? Because that is where the shift stops being gradual and starts becoming inevitable. There's an idea that's been repeated so often, it feels automatic, that you are constantly attracting things into your life, as if you're a magnet. As if something out there is moving toward you, responding to your thoughts, your focus, your intention. But what if that entire image is inverted? What if nothing is coming toward you? What if everything already exists? Not as physical objects arranged in space, but as possibilities, complete scenarios, fully formed versions of reality, coexisting at once. And what you call your life is simply the version you are currently perceiving. If that's true, then nothing is being attracted. Nothing is being pulled in. You're not bringing anything closer. You're selecting, positioning, tuning, like changing a frequency on a radio. The signal doesn't start when you tune in. It was already there. You just aligned with the frequency where it can be heard. And this explains something that often feels mysterious. Why certain changes happen suddenly, without a visible build-up, without a clear step-by-step path, as if you didn't create it, but stepped into it. Because in a very real sense, that's exactly what happened. You didn't construct that outcome. You aligned with the version where it already exists. Now, if this is the model, then the question changes completely. It's no longer, how do I attract what I want? It becomes, what am I currently tuned to? Because what defines your experience is not your intention alone, it's the frequency you're sustaining. And frequency isn't something you activate for a few minutes. It's what remains when you're not trying. Your baseline, your default, the state that continues in the background. And this is why trying to attract something often fails. Because trying implies distance. It implies absence. It implies that what you want is not accessible yet. And that very implication positions you outside of the frequency you're trying to reach. So instead of bringing it closer, it keeps it separate. Now, when this inversion becomes clear, something reorganizes internally. Because you realize there is no path to walk, no distance to close, only a position to adjust, not externally, internally. And that adjustment isn't about intensity, it's about precision, reducing noise, stopping the contradiction. Because when there is no contradiction, tuning happens naturally. No force, no effort, no visible process. And that's why, in certain moments of your life, things seem to flow effortlessly. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because, for a moment, you stopped interfering. You weren't trying to control. You weren't trying to predict. You weren't trying to make it happen. And in that absence of interference, your signal became clean, coherent, stable. And when that happens, reality doesn't need to be built. It simply appears as a direct reflection of what you're tuned to. So maybe the question is no longer, what do I need to do to attract this? Maybe it becomes something much more precise. What frequency am I sustaining without realizing it? If everything exists as possibility, then one question naturally emerges. What determines which version becomes real? What decides, out of all possible outcomes, the one you actually experience? The answer isn't outside of you. It's in how you observe. But observation here doesn't mean looking. It means sustaining. Holding a position so consistently that one version of reality becomes inevitable. Because at a deeper level, reality isn't fixed. It's being defined moment by moment, not by isolated thoughts, but by dominant states, what repeats, what stabilizes, what continues without effort. That is the true observer, not your intention, not your words, but what you are most of the time. And this explains something many people struggle to understand. Why does fear often seem to manifest faster than desire? Not because anything is working against you, but because fear is usually more stable, more practiced, more familiar, more consistent. It doesn't require effort. It's already embodied. While desire often exists only in specific moments, during visualization, during focused intention. But outside those moments, the old pattern returns. And the field doesn't respond to what appears occasionally. It responds to what dominates. So what you experience is not a reflection of what you want. It's a reflection of what you sustain. And this changes everything, because it's no longer about thinking positively or visualizing more clearly. It's about recognizing which state is actually leading, which signal is winning, not during your best moments, but during your normal ones, in your reactions, in your interpretations, in the way you move through everyday situations, because that's where reality is being defined. Not when you try to adjust it, but when you're not trying at all. And this is why there's often a gap between clarity and experience. You can know exactly what you want, but if your baseline remains unchanged, your results will reflect that baseline. Because directing attention is temporary. Sustaining a state is continuous, and reality always follows what continues. So maybe the real question is no longer, how do I focus on what I want? But something much more revealing, what am I actually sustaining when I'm not trying to focus at all? Because that is what's shaping your experience right now. At this point, it might seem like everything comes down to adjusting your state, and in many ways, it does. But there's something else happening beneath the surface, a kind of silent interference, one that disrupts the signal, even when you believe you're doing everything right. Because the issue is not access. Most people can access an aligned state. The issue is stability. It's not difficult to feel clear, for a moment, to feel certain, briefly, to feel present for a few minutes. But what happens after that? Because the signal doesn't disappear, it fragments. Part of you shifts into alignment, but another part continues operating from the old pattern, and both exist at the same time. Without you noticing, you feel clear, and then a subtle doubt appears. You feel grounded, and then tension returns. You feel certain, and then anticipation creeps in. Individually, these moments seem small, almost irrelevant, but they're not. Because reality doesn't respond to isolated moments. It responds to the overall pattern, to the average, to what repeats. And when the signal is divided, the result becomes unstable. Things move forward, then stall, shift slightly, then return. And it creates the feeling of being blocked, when in reality, there's no blockage, only inconsistency. Because thought alone cannot sustain a frequency. It can initiate, it can direct, but it cannot hold. What sustains the signal is the state. And the state is not just mental, it's physiological, it's behavioral, it's embedded in how you breathe, how you react, how you move through the day. So when you try to think correctly, but the rest of your system remains unchanged, the signal splits. You say one thing, but transmit another. And a divided signal doesn't collapse, it fluctuates. And that fluctuation is what keeps reality unstable. Not because you lack ability, but because the signal lacks continuity. And this is where the shift begins. Because the focus is no longer on correcting thoughts. It becomes about reducing interference, stopping the contradiction, no longer moving in and out of the same state. And this doesn't require more control. It requires more awareness. Awareness of what continues, even when you're not trying. Because that is what defines the clarity of your signal. And the clearer the signal, the more direct the response. At this point, one question becomes unavoidable. If thought alone doesn't sustain reality, what does? What actually carries the signal? The answer isn't in the mind, it's in the body. More specifically, in emotion, but not in the way it's usually understood. Emotion is not just a reaction to what happens outside of you. It's an ongoing internal state that continues in the background, whether you're aware of it or not. And that state is what transmits your signal. Think of it this way: thought sets direction, emotion gives it power. Without emotion, thought fades. It shifts, it changes, it disappears. But when emotion is present, the signal stabilizes. It gains intensity, it gains repetition, it becomes dominant. And dominance is what reality follows. Now notice something important. You can think in alignment for a few minutes, but if your baseline emotional state is anxiety, or tension, or anticipation, that's the signal that remains. Because it doesn't require effort. It's already embedded, already active, already familiar. And this is why there's often a gap between what you want and what you experience. Not because you lack clarity, but because the emotional signal is still pointing in a different direction. And this isn't a mistake. It's a priority system. Your system will always default to what is most stable, what is most repeated, what is most practiced. Now, when you begin to understand this, the approach changes completely. Because it's no longer about thinking better. It becomes about something more precise. What emotional state am I sustaining? Throughout the day, not during intentional moments, but during ordinary ones, in transitions, in pauses, in reactions. Because that's where the pattern lives. That's where the signal is reinforced. And here's where everything shifts. Emotion doesn't have to wait for reality to change. It can be generated first, not as a performance, not as a trick, but as a decision, a subtle adjustment, a different way of regulating your internal state, a slower breath, a more relaxed posture, a steadier tone, small changes that begin to reshape the emotional baseline. And when the baseline changes, the signal changes. And when the signal stabilizes, reality follows, not because it's being attracted, but because it's reflecting what is being consistently sustained. So maybe the question is no longer, what should I think? But something much more precise. What am I feeling on a consistent level? Because that is what your reality is built on. There's one part of this process that is almost always overlooked: the body, as if it were just a container, a support system, something that follows the mind. But in reality, it's the opposite. The body doesn't follow, it reveals. It shows, with precision, what is actually being sustained. Because while thought can shift quickly, the body does not respond to intention. It responds to repetition, to what has been lived over and over, until it became automatic. And that makes it the most honest indicator you have. You can tell yourself you're calm, but tension in the body says otherwise. You can say you trust, but shallow breathing reveals something different. You can try to hold certainty, but small movements expose hesitation. And the point isn't to control any of this. It's to notice. Because reality is not responding to what you're thinking. It's responding to what you're transmitting. And the body is the primary transmitter. It carries your history, your patterns, your automatic responses, everything that has been repeated enough to become natural. And this is why there's often a disconnect between what you try to hold mentally and what actually shows up, because the body is still operating from the same baseline, the same conditioning, the same frequency. Now, when you start including the body in this awareness, everything deepens, because you stop trying to convince the mind and start observing the system. The way you sit, the way you walk, the way you breathe, the way you react to small triggers, all of it is signal. All of it is communication, not occasionally, continuously. Now here's where this becomes powerful, The same body that reveals can also recalibrate, not by acting, but by aligning. Small adjustments that seem simple, but directly affect your state. A deeper breath slows the internal rhythm. A more open posture reduces contraction. A conscious movement shifts your internal response. And when these adjustments are repeated, they begin to reshape the baseline without force, without control. Just through consistency, because the body learns through repetition, and once it learns, it stabilizes. And when the body stabilizes a new state, the signal becomes clean, continuous, coherent, and as interference drops, the response becomes immediate. So maybe the shift isn't only in what you think, or even in what you feel, but in how all of it is being physically sustained. Because in the end, it's the body that turns a moment into a baseline. And once it becomes a baseline, reality no longer needs to be pushed. It simply follows. If you bring everything together so far, one principle starts to stand out. Simple, but absolute. Reality doesn't respond to what appears occasionally. It responds to what dominates, to what remains, to what wins, most of the time. Because within you, there isn't just one signal. There are many. Different thoughts, different emotions, different reactions, all coexisting, but they don't carry equal weight. They don't last the same amount of time. They don't repeat at the same intensity. And within that system, one pattern always prevails. One state becomes dominant, the one that shows up automatically, the one that requires the least effort, the one that continues, even when you're not trying. That is the state that defines your experience, not your best moment, not your peak clarity, not your intentional practice, but what remains after everything else fades. And this explains something that confuses a lot of people. Why strong moments of alignment don't always translate into real change. Because alignment isn't dominant yet. It appears, but it doesn't stay. Meanwhile, the old pattern still occupies more space, more time, more repetition, and that's why it wins. Not because it's stronger in intensity, but because it's stronger in continuity. And this shifts the entire strategy, because it's no longer about creating powerful moments. It becomes about stabilizing the state, making the new pattern more present than the old one, more frequent, more natural. Because once that happens, reality doesn't have to decide. It simply follows. It reflects what is most stable. Now here's a simple way to observe this. Ask yourself, what shows up automatically when I'm not trying to change anything? That is what's dominating. That is what's repeating. And that is what is being reflected. So instead of trying to eliminate old patterns completely, the real shift is this: increase the presence of the new one, not forcefully, but consistently, returning to it every time you notice you've left, without conflict, without frustration, just returning. And over time, that return becomes natural. It becomes your baseline. And when it becomes your baseline, something begins to reorganize. Your reactions change, your decisions shift, your internal responses adjust. And gradually, without a clear moment, the new state takes over. And once it dominates, reality aligns, not because it's being attracted, but because there is no longer another pattern to reflect. At this point, one thing becomes clear. The issue isn't effort, it's order. The sequence you've been following. Because the default assumption is simple. First, reality changes. Then your internal state follows. First, the result appears. Then the feeling comes. First, it happens. Then you respond. And that feels natural. Because that's how most people interpret everything. But within the framework you're beginning to see, that order doesn't hold. It's inverted. Because if reality reflects your dominant state, then the state cannot come after. It has to come first. Not as a reaction, but as a baseline. And this is where resistance shows up. Because feeling something before there's evidence feels unnatural, forced, even illogical. But that reaction exists for a reason. Your system has been conditioned to depend on external confirmation before allowing internal change. But here, the process reverses. The internal state stops reacting and starts instructing. And this isn't about pretending. It's not about forcing a belief. It's about adjusting the state, independent of conditions, subtly, gradually, without intensity. Because this isn't about creating emotional peaks. It's about establishing a new baseline. A state that begins to show up more often, even in ordinary moments, without needing a reason. And it can start in simple ways: a steadier breath, even when tension appears; a more open posture, even when nothing demands it; a quiet sense of trust, without proof; small signals that begin to reshape the foundation. And over time, that foundation stops depending on the external. It sustains itself. Now, when that shift happens, the entire dynamic changes. Because the state is no longer a consequence, it becomes the source. And when the state becomes the source, reality is no longer something you move toward. It becomes something that responds, not slowly, but precisely. So maybe the question is no longer, what needs to happen for me to feel this way? But the inverse, can I sustain this state before anything happens? Because that inversion is what changes the speed. As this inversion begins to stabilize, something subtle starts to change. At first, it's almost unnoticeable, but over time, it becomes undeniable. The sense that you have to make everything happen begins to fade, and in its place, a different perception emerges. As if instead of moving toward something, something is moving toward you. Or more precisely, as if you're being pulled, not forcefully, not dramatically, but consistently, quietly, precisely. And this changes the entire experience. Because you stop operating from effort and begin to notice movement without pushing. Decisions feel clearer. Certain paths lose relevance without struggle. Others begin to appear without planning. And the most interesting part is that it doesn't come with a clear explanation. You can't fully justify it, but you can feel it. And this feeling is not intensity, it's direction, a kind of internal alignment that indicates, without noise, where to move. Now this only becomes accessible when interference drops, because as long as there's constant effort, control, the need to predict, this signal gets drowned out. But as your state stabilizes, as the baseline becomes more coherent, the signal becomes clearer. And what once felt uncertain begins to feel continuous, as if the next steps are already organized, and you're simply following them. This can feel unfamiliar at first, because it challenges the idea that everything depends on conscious effort. But in practice, it's simpler than it seems. If all possibilities already exist, then there is also a version of you already living what you've been trying to reach, not as imagination, but as a state, a pattern, a frequency. And that version is not ahead of you. It's available, now. And as your state begins to match that baseline, the gap between now and later collapses. And what emerges is that feeling of being pulled. Not because something external is deciding for you, but because you've stopped maintaining the resistance that kept everything separate. And without that resistance, movement happens, naturally, without excessive effort, without constant trying, without the pressure of making it happen. And at that point, something becomes clear. You're not creating the path. You're responding to it. And that response is what accelerates everything. Because it removes unnecessary time, removes detours, removes the need to control each step. And in its place, a kind of flow appears, where things no longer feel distant, only available. There's a common assumption that intensity is what creates change, that to shift reality, you need strong emotion, excitement, high energy, elevated states, as if the more intense the feeling, the faster the result. But if you look closely, you'll notice something different. The most stable states are not the most intense ones. They're the quiet ones, the neutral ones, the ones that don't fluctuate. And this changes everything. Because if reality follows coherence, then intensity is not the key. Stability is. And few states are as stable as peace. Not passive peace, not disengagement, but a form of calm that doesn't depend on confirmation. A state where there is no urgency, no pressure, no sense that something needs to happen soon. And that's exactly why it's so powerful, because it removes the main source of interference, need. Where there is need, there is tension. Where there is tension, there is contraction, and contraction breaks coherence. But when need dissolves, the system relaxes. The body slows down, the mind stops anticipating, and the state stabilizes. And in that stabilization, something unexpected happens. Speed increases, not because you're trying to move faster, but because there is no longer resistance creating delay. And this feels counterintuitive, because most people believe that wanting something more makes it happen faster. But in practice, the more urgency there is, the more the state aligns with lack. And the more it aligns with lack, the more reality reflects that. Now, when you enter a state of peace, without abandoning what you want, but without depending on it, something aligns. Because the signal changes from, I need this to happen, to, this doesn't define me anymore. And that shift removes the delay, because without urgency, without pressure, without tension, the signal becomes clean, coherent, continuous. And when that happens, reality doesn't need to wait. It simply follows. So maybe it's not about feeling more, but about feeling more steadily, more simply, more quietly. Because in the end, it's not intensity that accelerates, it's the absence of conflict. There's a moment that cannot be predicted. There's no count, no number of repetitions, no clear marker that says, this is it. And yet, it comes, quietly, without announcement, without visible preparation, almost unnoticed at first. But when it happens, it's unmistakable. Something has shifted. Not outside, first, but inside. The way you perceive, the way you respond, the way you hold yourself is no longer the same. And with that shift, something else disappears. The need to make it happen. Not because you gave up, but because it no longer feels necessary. And this is the detail most people miss. The shift doesn't begin in the external world. It begins when internal contradiction ends. When there's no longer a part of you trying, while another part still doubts. No oscillation, no back and forth. What once required effort becomes natural. What once needed to be maintained becomes automatic. And at that point, there is no more attempt. There is only consistency. And that consistency is what triggers what looks like a sudden change. But it wasn't sudden. It was stabilization, an alignment that held long enough to stop being interrupted. And once that happens, reality responds. Not gradually, not step by step, but as a whole. As if something that was already complete simply became visible. And this can feel strange, because what once felt distant now feels obvious, natural, familiar, as if it had always been there. And in a way, it was. It just wasn't accessible from the previous state. Now, this doesn't happen because you achieved something, or because you did enough. It happens because you stopped sustaining the opposite. You stopped feeding the version of yourself that was still waiting. And in the absence of that version, what remains becomes inevitable. And this is why the collapse cannot be forced, because it doesn't depend on intensity. It depends on the absence of interference, on continuity, on sustained coherence. And once that is established, there is no more question of when, because at that point, it already happened. Even if the external is still reorganizing, even if some pieces are still adjusting, the foundation has shifted. And once the foundation shifts, everything else follows. After that point, something no longer makes sense. The idea that you need to keep trying, not because you've stopped caring, but because the logic of trying loses its function. What once required effort now operates from somewhere else. Quieter, more stable, more direct. And this changes how you see yourself, because you no longer experience yourself as someone building a reality. You begin to recognize yourself as someone sustaining a position. And that difference is deeper than it seems. Before, there was constant movement, a sense that something needed to be done, that there was still somewhere to get to. Now, that fades. Not because action disappears, but because action no longer comes from lack. It comes from coherence, from a state that doesn't question as much, that doesn't fluctuate the same way, that doesn't need constant confirmation. And with that, your relationship with reality changes. What once felt distant no longer registers as absence. It becomes expression, adjustment, organization, but not something to achieve. And this also changes your relationship with time, because without the idea of not yet, time loses its weight. It's no longer the distance between you and something. It becomes a reflection of what is already being sustained, without urgency, without pressure, without the need to anticipate what's next. And in that space, something else emerges, continuity, as if there is no longer a clear line between now and later, as if everything exists within the same field, just at different levels of visibility. And this is not an ending, it's a different starting point. Because from here, it's no longer about reaching something specific. It's about maintaining coherence regardless of what appears. It's about not automatically returning to previous patterns, not out of force, but out of awareness. Because now, you see enough to not go back unconsciously. And this doesn't require perfection. It requires presence, awareness of what is being sustained, and the subtle choice to remain. There's a point where information stops being something you understand and starts becoming something you sustain. And from here, that's what matters. Not how much you absorbed, but how much of this remains with you after. Because understanding this is only the beginning. What actually changes your experience is integration. What stays with you when you return to your day, when ordinary situations reappear, when your environment hasn't fully reflected what you've already shifted internally. That's where everything is defined. Because transformation doesn't come from moments of clarity, it comes from what you maintain after them. And with that in mind, there is something deeper available, not as more information, but as a way to stabilize this state, to make this level of coherence more natural, more continuous, without depending on effort or specific moments. If you feel ready to go deeper into that, there's a resource designed with that exact intention. Not to teach something new, but to reinforce what has already started to make sense within you, to help you remain in this level of awareness with more consistency. You'll find access in the pinned comment. No urgency, no pressure, only if it resonates. And more important than anything else, notice how you move from here. Not in ideal moments, but in ordinary ones, in small pauses, in subtle reactions, because that's where coherence stabilizes. And once it stabilizes, you're no longer moving towards something. You're continuing a state that has already begun.